Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Horror Stories. I know many of you use these episodes to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Story 1. In 1979, I was working as a gravedigger in a cemetery that, by decision of the city, was closed down. The authorities decided to open a new graveyard, but they didn't hire any of the old staff. Overnight, I found myself unemployed. Being a gravedigger was the only thing I really knew how to do well, so I started looking for a job in a nearby town. By chance, when I arrived, I discovered that the cemetery in that town was looking for a new caretaker. The previous one had left, but no one wanted to explain why. It seemed strange to me, although I wasn't in a position to be picky. I needed to provide for my family. I walked into the office of the cemetery administrator, and after a brief conversation about my experience in the trade, I was offered the position immediately. They gave me housing inside the cemetery itself, in a remote and quiet area, since I wasn't from the area. I didn't hesitate and accepted right away. I needed the job. I was assigned the night shift, which was the only one available. Even though I would have preferred to work during the day, I couldn't afford to turn down the opportunity. In the end, what mattered was keeping the job. The housing they provided was modest but comfortable enough. The hardest part was being away from my wife and 2 children. That's why one of the few conditions I asked for when accepting the job was to have 2 consecutive days off each week so I could return home and be with my family. I agreed with my boss that those days off would be on weekends. My wife, Sarah, wasn't thrilled about the idea, but I promised her that as soon as a position opened up in the new cemetery in our city, Millfield, I would try to get a job there. My new routine started almost immediately. From Monday to Friday, I worked from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. The nights were quiet. I just had to do rounds and perform maintenance tasks on the graves. On weekends, I spent time with my family. Living inside the cemetery had its pros and cons. The main advantage was being close to work. I didn't waste time commuting or spend money on fuel. The most obvious downside was the loneliness, but over time I got used to it. In the first week, I realized that the nights in that cemetery were different from what I was used to. In my previous job, I had always worked day shifts and had never experienced what it was like to be completely alone in such a vast place full of stories. The tombstones and mausoleums seemed to come to life at night, casting shadows that danced with the wind and making sounds whose origins I couldn't identify. Getting to know the rest of the team was a gradual process. There was a groundskeeper, a security guard, and the administrator. They were all kind, but I noticed they were hiding something, as if they shared a secret they weren't willing to reveal. The guard, Mr. Thompson, was the oldest of the group and used to tell strange stories about the cemetery. He claimed that weird things had happened there, although he never went into detail. During the first week, my duties were simple: patrol the cemetery, make sure everything was in order, watch for intruders, and take care of basic maintenance on the graves. The nights were long and silent, but I followed my routine with discipline, always alert for anything out of the ordinary. On the first night, I realized that loneliness would be my constant companion. The silence was only broken by the natural sounds of the environment: the crunching of leaves, the distant call of a nocturnal bird, or the occasional barking of a dog. Sounds that would go unnoticed during the day took on an unsettling tone under the cover of darkness. The house I lived in, though simple, was cozy. It had a small garden in the front and was far enough from the cemetery to give me some privacy. At first, it was hard to sleep during the day, but I eventually got used to it. The routine was exhausting, but I was determined to give my best. I needed that job. Weeks passed, and I started to notice strange things. One night, while doing one of my rounds, I realized that a grave was open. I approached, thinking it was vandalism, but there were no signs of forced entry. Everything was in place, except the headstone seemed to have been carefully removed and then put back again. On another occasion, I heard whispers coming from one of the oldest sections of the cemetery. I went to investigate, but found no one. These incidents started to unsettle me, but I tried to stay calm and continue my duties. One particularly dark night while making my rounds, I felt a strange cold current, as if someone were watching me. I looked around but saw no one. I continued working, though the feeling didn't go away. I decided to finish the round as quickly as possible and returned to the small cemetery office. During those lonely nights, I began to question whether taking the night shift had really been a good choice. The cemetery, which at first seemed like a peaceful place, now felt eerie and unsettling. Even so, I needed the job and was determined not to let those strange episodes affect me. Over time, I became more familiar with the responsibilities of the place and understood that despite how odd it all felt, it was a space that required respect and care. I kept the graves clean and in good condition, repaired headstones when necessary, and most importantly, made sure to maintain calm and order throughout the night. It was in the third week of work when things truly got strange. It was a night like any other, and I was on one of my usual rounds when suddenly I saw a girl, no older than 13, walking alone through the cemetery. I was startled. Her presence concerned me, as the cemetery was closed at night and no one should have been there. I approached her cautiously to speak with her. She looked visibly scared and told me she was visiting a grave. It seemed quite unusual, but I didn't want to alarm her any further. I kindly asked her to come with me and took her to the cemetery office. I asked her to sit on a bench near the door while I called the police. But as soon as I hung up and stepped outside to talk to her again, she was gone. She had vanished without a trace. The officers arrived quickly within 5 minutes. I told them everything that had happened, and they immediately began inspecting the cemetery. They found nothing. They suggested I was probably exhausted and may have hallucinated. That planted a seed of doubt in me. What if I really was imagining things? The truth is, the girl had seemed so real, so vulnerable, so human. But after the police visit, I began to wonder, had it all been a result of exhaustion? Despite my doubts, I continued with my usual routine in the following days. A week later, she appeared again. It was the same girl with the same frightened expression. This time, I decided to act differently. I didn't want to scare her or waste time calling the police without first trying to understand what was happening. I asked her again what she was doing there, and once more she told me she was visiting a grave. So I tried a different approach. I asked for the name of the person she wanted to visit. She gave me a name I didn't recognize. I took her again to the cemetery office and checked the records. There was no grave with that name. When I went back to speak with her to tell her that, she was gone again. Once more, she had vanished without anyone noticing. This situation began to deeply disturb me. Who was this girl? Why did she only appear at night? And why did she always disappear in such a mysterious way? Days later, during another round, I saw her again. This time I decided not to question her directly. I just walked beside her as she moved forward with determination, as if she knew exactly where she was going. Something in me decided not to interrupt her. Curiosity and concern were eating me up inside. As we walked, I tried to make conversation to learn more about her. I asked her name, and with a distant look, she replied that it was the same as the grave she was looking for. That chilled my blood. Even so, I continued walking with her. I asked about her parents, and she replied that she didn't know where they were, that she hadn't seen them in a long time. Her voice was filled with sadness, and you could feel the pain in every word. We kept walking in silence, and my discomfort only grew. Finally, we arrived in front of an old, almost forgotten grave, hidden among more recent burials. The girl stopped, looked me straight in the eye, and in a calm but melancholic voice told me she was afraid of knives. I was startled. I always carried a pocket knife with me during rounds for safety in case of intruders or animals. She seemed to know that. That only added to my confusion. Before I could ask why she said that, she continued speaking in a soft but sorrowful tone. She confessed that she had been stabbed to death and that she was buried right there, where we were standing. A shiver ran down my spine. Her voice was so real, so intense that I was paralyzed, trying to process what I had just heard. When I looked at her again, she was gone. The whole place felt colder, gloomier. My heart was pounding, and a mix of fear and sadness overwhelmed me. I ran back to my house inside the cemetery and locked the door. I spent the rest of the night without sleep, going over the girl's story in my mind. When morning came, I decided to talk to my supervisor. I told him what had happened, though without too many details, so I wouldn't seem insane. I asked him to switch me to the day shift and also requested to stop living inside the cemetery. To my surprise, he agreed without asking too many questions. That struck me as strange, as if he already knew something I didn't. That attitude only fueled my suspicions. Even though I would now have to drive more than an hour and a half each day to and from work, I considered it the best possible decision. I'd rather deal with the fatigue from travel than continue facing that unsettling feeling the cemetery gave me at night. I began working during the day, and the routine became much more bearable. However, every time I passed near the girl's grave, I felt a chill down my spine. Something inside me told me her story wasn't over yet. A few months later, a friend offered me a job in a project that was about to start. I didn't hesitate for a second. I accepted immediately. The new job was close to home, and I could finally be with my family without ever having to worry about the dead, ever again. Story 2. My name is Henry, and I was a gravedigger for 20 years at Forest Hills Cemetery in Boston. Over that time, I witnessed many strange things, but nothing compares to what I experienced just a few months ago. It was a workday like any other. I was going through my usual routine, digging graves, tending to the headstones, making repairs when necessary. That morning, I received a work order to prepare a new grave. I began digging as always, enjoying the silence and peace that the cemetery offered. Many consider it a gloomy place, but to me, it was always a refuge of tranquility. After several hours of work, my shovel struck something hard. At first, I thought it was a rock, which wasn't uncommon, but as I kept digging, I realized it wasn't that. It was something entirely different. I carefully removed the soil, and what I discovered chilled me to the bone. It was an old wedding dress buried next to a skeleton. The dress was dirty, torn, and discolored with age. The skeletal remains were in very poor condition, nearly crumbling at the touch. Who would bury a bride there, in such a shallow grave and without any kind of identification? None of it made sense. The cemetery has very strict rules regarding burials and graves, and this case clearly violated all of them. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I'm not someone who scares easily, but that discovery left me uneasy. I looked around, but there was no one. The usual silence of the cemetery now felt heavier, as if the entire place was watching what I was doing. I knew I couldn't just ignore it. I went straight to the cemetery's administration to report what I had found. My supervisor, Mark, listened carefully and seemed concerned. After a brief conversation, he gave me instructions that I found quite strange. He asked me to rebury the body, but in another, more distant area. I asked if that procedure was correct, since in all my years of experience I had never seen anything like it. Mark only replied that those were orders I had to follow. There was something in the way he spoke that made me distrustful, but I obeyed. I returned to the site with a knot in my stomach. I performed the burial with the utmost respect and dignity possible. I chose a secluded corner of the cemetery, an area that almost no one visited. During the entire process, I couldn't get the image of that wedding dress and skeleton out of my mind. Something about all of it felt wrong. In the days following the new burial, life at the cemetery seemed to return to normal, or at least that's what I believed at first. I continued with my daily tasks, trying to set aside the discomfort caused by the discovery of that buried bride. However, it didn't take long before strange things started happening. It was a Thursday night, well past closing hours. I was finishing up locking the main gate when, in the distance, I noticed a pale figure among the tombstones. I assumed it was a visitor who hadn't left in time. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the figure to ask them to leave, since the cemetery was about to close. As I approached, the figure became clearer. It was a woman dressed in a dirty and torn wedding dress, very similar to the one I had found buried. A chill ran through my body. She had her back to me, and her shoulders were trembling as if she were sobbing. I got closer, calling out to her, but she didn't respond. When I was just a few feet away, she stopped crying and slowly turned toward me. What I saw left me frozen. Her face was pale, distorted, with sad and deeply dark eyes. Before I could say or do anything, she disappeared. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. I stood there motionless, unable to believe what I had just witnessed. I returned home completely disturbed. I couldn't sleep that night. The next morning, as soon as I arrived at the cemetery, I looked for Mark and told him what I had seen. He looked at me seriously and told me it was best not to pay attention to it, that it was probably just my mind playing tricks on me after everything that had happened. I tried to follow his advice, but the appearances didn't stop. In the days that followed, the bride's figure began to show up in different parts of the cemetery, always at night. Sometimes I saw her crying among the graves. Other times I didn't see her, but I could hear her sobbing, as if it came from some hidden corner. The situation started to affect me deeply. I felt nervous, tense, and each night it became harder to do my job. I searched for information about any possible stories related to brides buried in the cemetery, but found nothing in the official records. I decided to ask the older gravediggers, but they all seemed to avoid the topic. No one wanted to talk about it. One of them, an elderly man named Louis, pulled me aside and advised me not to get involved. That strange things had always happened in that cemetery, and it was best not to stir up the past. Days turned into weeks, and the presence of the spectral bride grew stronger. I did everything I could to find out who she had been in life. I reviewed old archives, consulted with residents in the area who had lived there for decades, and even researched local legends that might offer some clue, but I found absolutely nothing. It was as if she had never existed. Each day became a new torment. The bride's figure appeared more frequently, always crying, always watching me with those empty, sad, and desolate eyes. Sometimes her sobbing echoed between the tombstones. Other times I could feel her gaze fixed on me, even when I couldn't see her directly. The cemetery, which once felt familiar, almost comforting, had become a constant nightmare. It was now a place filled with anguish and something I couldn't explain in words. I told my wife everything I was experiencing, but she thought it was the result of stress, that I was overworked and needed to rest. My close friends didn't believe me either. They said it was probably accumulated fatigue from years of working in such a solitary environment. But I knew that what I was seeing and feeling was real. With each passing night, I felt my mental health deteriorating. I couldn't sleep well, lost my appetite, and my mood declined. The presence of that woman wouldn't let me rest. I felt like I was on the verge of losing my mind. In a final attempt to understand what was happening to me, I decided to speak again with Mark and Louis. I explained the situation in detail and begged them to tell me something, anything that could help me make sense of it. But all I received were sympathetic looks and recommendations to leave things as they were. John, who had always been very understanding with me, suggested I take a few days off, but I knew that wouldn't solve anything. I couldn't walk away from what was happening there, not without first facing the thing that was tormenting me. Work at the cemetery had become unbearable. That ghostly bride wouldn't leave me alone, and with each passing day, I felt myself slipping further into an abyss from which there would be no return. As the days went by, my condition worsened. I couldn't sleep, barely ate, and every time I stepped into the cemetery, I felt as if a shadow enveloped me. Working there became a psychological torture. The bride's figure, her heartbreaking cries, her empty gaze, followed me everywhere. Finally, I reached my limit. I couldn't take it anymore. I had no mental or physical strength left to continue in that place. I made the hardest decision of my life, to quit. After 20 years working as a gravedigger at Forest Hills, I knew it was time to go. I was surrounded by memories and visions that haunted me relentlessly. I informed my supervisor of my decision. Although he seemed surprised, he accepted my resignation without many questions, which deep down didn't surprise me. I felt he also knew more than he ever wanted to admit. On my last day before leaving for good, I walked to the spot where I had found that buried wedding dress. I stood in silence for a few minutes, as if I wanted to say goodbye to her, or perhaps ask for forgiveness. I don't know if it was my imagination, but I felt a deep cold around me, a chilling breeze that raised goosebumps on my skin, as if that presence was watching me one last time. When I walked through the cemetery gates for the last time, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. I had spent 2 decades of my life there, among tombs and silence, but I knew I couldn't go on. The scars that experience left on me are still with me today. And even now, with the passage of time, sometimes in the stillness of the night, I think I hear the distant cry of a woman, and a chill once again runs down my spine. Story 3. My name is Mike, and I'm the gravedigger at a rural cemetery hidden deep in the woods of West Virginia. Working here had always been a peaceful experience. The place is completely isolated, surrounded by trees and a silence that only nature can offer. Most of the burials I perform are for people who have lived their entire lives in this region. I know almost everyone who rests here, or at least I knew their families. It all started a few months ago. I was finishing the process of closing a grave late in the afternoon when I felt a strange presence, as if someone were watching me. I looked up and saw 2 glowing points in the middle of the forest. At first I thought it was an animal's eyes, maybe a cat or a dog, but those eyes didn't move. They remained fixed on me, as if studying me. I tried to ignore it and kept working, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. Weeks went by, and those eyes began appearing over and over again, always at night. They showed up in different places, as if they were following me. I started thinking maybe I was becoming paranoid. At first, the eyes appeared at the edge of the cemetery near the tree line. They stood out in the dark, glowing with an unnatural intensity. Every time I looked at them, they remained still, as if they were waiting for something, as if they were watching. With each passing night, it seemed those eyes came a little closer. Sometimes during my nighttime rounds, I'd see them between the tombstones glowing with a cold, piercing light. A chill would run down my spine every time I saw them, as if a cold wind had passed right through me. It was a strange feeling, as if beyond watching me, they were also judging me. I talked to some coworkers and even my wife, but they all laughed it off. They told me I was probably imagining things, or at worst it was just some nocturnal animal. That frustrated me because I knew what was happening was real and far from normal. One night the eyes appeared near the cemetery office, the place where I store my tools and keep all my work notes. This time they were closer than ever, right at the edge of the light from the pole that illuminates the entrance. My heart began pounding, and my hands trembled as I held the flashlight. When I pointed the light toward the eyes, they vanished into the shadows, but the feeling that something was wrong became even more intense. The next day I walked through the area where I had seen the eyes, hoping to find some clue. I searched for footprints, signs of animals, any kind of trace, but there was nothing. Not a single footprint, not a single hint. It was as if those eyes came from nothing and returned to nothing. Each night their presence felt more oppressive. Deep down I felt they didn't belong to any normal animal. There was something human in them, something disturbing. They made me feel vulnerable. I started sleeping poorly. Even at home, I had the feeling that someone was watching me from the dark. The nights were worse. During my rounds, I was more alert than ever. I upgraded to a stronger flashlight and, as a precaution, began carrying a pocket knife. The cemetery didn't have a security system, and I needed to feel protected somehow. Every time those eyes appeared, I would shine the light directly at them, but they always vanished before I could see anything beyond the glow. As days passed, they started showing up more often. I felt like they were everywhere, surrounding me, hunting me. A constant sense of being cornered overwhelmed me, as if something was getting ready to pounce. Even when I couldn't see them, I felt their gaze locked on me, as if they were hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. My nerves were shot. Any noise in the middle of the night startled me. A crunch, a snapping branch, the call of a night bird. Everything felt like a threat. One night as I walked among the tombstones, I saw them again. But this time they were different, more intense, closer. They glowed with a force I hadn't felt before, as if they wanted to communicate something. I lit up the area with my flashlight, but as always, the eyes dissolved into the darkness. I stood frozen. For the first time, I felt that this wasn't just a presence, it was a warning. It was in the third week since the eyes began to appear that something truly terrifying happened. That night was especially dark and silent, like so many others in the rural cemetery where I worked. During one of my rounds, I noticed the glowing eyes were even closer. This time, they seemed to be near an old, nearly forgotten grave, worn down by the passage of time. With my heart pounding, I held my flashlight in one hand and the knife in the other. I approached slowly. The shadows around me seemed to move unnaturally, like something was about to reveal itself. And then it happened. The shadows began to take shape. They turned into a dark figure with no defined outline, a mass of pure darkness, but with the same glowing eyes I had seen so many times. Before I could react or understand what I was looking at, the entity lunged at me. The feeling was like being torn apart by invisible claws. I tried to fight back with all my strength, but those claws were fast, sharp, like blades tearing at my skin, leaving deep, burning wounds. The pain was unbearable, and the attack seemed endless. Finally, the shadow backed off and disappeared into the darkness of the forest. I was left lying on the ground, exhausted and bleeding. With great effort, I managed to reach the cemetery office. I disinfected the wounds as best I could and called the hospital immediately. The trip there was a nightmare. Fear and pain consumed me. When I arrived, the doctors examined my injuries and said they looked like deep cuts, as if caused by the claws of a wild animal. They treated me with antibiotics and preventative injections to avoid infection, but I knew it wasn't a regular animal. What attacked me was something else, something I couldn't explain. I chose not to tell them the truth. Who would have believed me? I left the hospital with the sense that something inside me had broken forever. The terror stayed with me, and the glowing eyes kept appearing in my nightmares. I knew what I had lived through was real and couldn't be explained by natural causes. That experience left its mark not only on my skin but deep in my mind. The physical scars healed over time, but the others, those remain open. I knew for certain that what had attacked me wasn't any ordinary animal. Those shadows, those intensely glowing eyes that watched me from the darkness, continued haunting me, even in my sleep. I'd wake up sweating, gasping, with the vivid image of that glow following me through the tombstones. I had no idea what that thing had been, and I didn't want to find out. As soon as I was well enough, I resigned from my job at the cemetery. I couldn't set foot in that place again. I found another job months later, far from the forest, far from the graves, far from anything that could remind me of that night. But I will never forget what I lived through. Sometimes when the night is especially quiet, when the wind blows through the trees like a distant whisper, I think I see those eyes again in the distance, and a chill, inevitable, runs down my spine.